Robert A. Pruitt holds a BA from Texas Southern University in studio art and an MFA from the University of Texas in Austin with a concentration in painting. He has exhibited his work locally, nationally, and internationally, most notably at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Contemporary Arts Museum Houston, the Dallas Museum of Art, the Bronx Museum of Art, the 2006 Whitney Biennial, and the Studio Museum in Harlem. He has participated in influential residencies such as the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, Art Pace in San Antonio, the Fabric Workshop Museum, and the Bemis Center for Contemporary Art. He has received numerous awards, including the Louis Comfort Tiffany Award, I'm saying it the Canadian way, the Joan Mitchell Artist Grant, the Artadia Award, a project grant from the Creative Capital Foundation, and the William H. Johnson Award. Please join me in welcoming Robert Pruitt to the Ulrich Museum.
Turned off. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for joining us this evening and for agreeing to do this. So I think what we'll just do is pass the mic back and forth. And I thought what I would do is begin by softballing a question to you. I thought I would ask you to speak about your first kind of excursions into art making.
I mean, like my first excursions? I mean, it started with comic books, drawing Spider-Man, like Wolverine, like obsessively, like sort of, copying what I saw in comics. And yeah, even when I went to college, my plan was to become a comic book artist. And I mean, that changed pretty quickly. But yeah, I don't know.
So what was it exactly? Was there a precise moment, or was it more of a gradual shift, or that made you decide, or led you to the decision to actually commit to, deciding to become a working and practicing artist?
I can give you a long rambling answer. So a few different things happened. I mean, like my first job, all this is early, I was, teenager, 19, 20, working at a grocery store and going to college and all that stuff. And like, basically my sort of like, I guess in some ways, what you would call like your political consciousness kind of changed through some like, working at a job, watching people like, I won't go into all of that. It was just working for a corporation at the lowest level was very educational. And then realizing that the company I wanted to work for, Marvel Comics, who I still like, I read Marvel, but it never occurred to me that it was a corporation. And I started to realize through the practice of art making in undergrad that I had much more autonomy and control over what I was doing than I would if I was drawing the Fantastic Four. Like I would not be in charge of what those characters were doing, what they looked like, what the stories were. I would be hired to, and still that was all just sort of like dreaming about doing that, but even that seemed like I will never be able to like own Marvel Comics, so let me shift all of this energy towards this new thing that I've discovered. Because I didn't grow up going to museums, like I had no sort of like introduction to art making, and so it was all new when I started college. Like the idea of, I remember being like deathly afraid of like my first day at school, because I was like, I don't know anything about mixing colors. I don't even know what that is. Like going into a painting class, I hadn't, like, it was zilch. But going in there and like realizing like everybody was coming from like very similar spaces, like, and that I could actually like, create my own kind of practice became very exciting, and it's been that way ever since. Yeah. Although I want to go back to comics, and that's some stuff I'm planning in the future, but my own comics, but yeah. You have to take the mic.
Okay, no, which is fine. I mean, we're really here for you. I don't really think people need to hear my commentary that much. But I think that's interesting. And I guess I'm curious as well because of when I went to to undergrad. I actually went to art school as well. And I went to school with a lot of people who were coming from working class backgrounds. And becoming an artist was not necessarily seen as a viable option. And even if you're not coming from a working class background, the practice of making art, the energy that goes into having the time to think about art, to actually produce art, this is labor, or this is a type of labor that's often seen as being a luxury. So I'm wondering, and even now, and I mean, you know this, you're someone who has achieved a, very high degree of success in your work. Okay, well, it looks great from the outside, but just the precarity in becoming an artist. I think that the work of making art is often romanticized, and that's something that can be frustrating for me as a curator. But I also have, I am humbled and awed by people's decisions to devote their life to creative work and to becoming an artist. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that and what it was that kind of helped to shift your practice or your attention away from producing comics to producing quote unquote fine art or working in those traditions.
Much of that, I think, was informed by the undergraduate program that I was in, Texas Southern University, which was started by John Biggers. I mean, you know all this, but you guys may not know this. John Biggers is an artist. He was from North Carolina. He was one of the first black artists to kind of visit Africa and bring back sort of this this way of working that incorporated many of the senses of design and mythology and culture and history from these sort of West African countries, and begin to sort of incorporate them to African American culture in the United States, particularly in the South. And so he started this art department, and he wanted to create sort of a tradition of art making that was from a totally different non-Western perspective. And that thing, I wouldn't say it flourished, but in the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, many, and the main, what am I trying to say? They were teaching people to be art educators. It wasn't just about coming out to be, an artist, and it was about the importance of art making and reflecting a culture and a community and going out and teaching other people and other artists that same thing so that it would tenfold kind of expand. And for a while, that kind of thing seemed to be about to happen. But of course, this thing was happening in a political climate of civil rights movement, Black Power movement, and on. I think as those sort of politics and that movement changed, a lot of that energy shifted. So by the time I came in the 90s, that stuff was still very present, but it wasn't, I guess what I'm trying to say, I didn't feel as beholden to a lot of that process as I think students who came before me did. And so I think there was actually a little bit of tension between what the department was and was trying to teach, and then those of us coming in, talking about Batman and manga, and it just, I don't want to exaggerate the tension, but there was a little bit of tension. My instructor, my drawing instructor, Harvey Johnson, who worked directly with John Biggers had retired by the time I started at TSU. I learned from Harvey Johnson, who was taught by John Biggers, who was taught by Charles White. And Charles White is a very seminal sort of artist in terms of black figuration and that sort of thing. But yeah, by the time I got there, and yeah, me and Harvey, it just wasn't, I had a hard time. I didn't do well in those classes. But as I got older, those things it just really started to kind of, settle into me, much of what I was trying to push away. And so a lot of it is still, it informs how I approach my art making.
Well, some of the, I can definitely see an interest in community in your work. And some of, I guess it's more identifiable in some of the projects that you've mounted, which are more sort of collaborative artists in which you're working, or sorry, projects in which you're working in tandem with other artists. But I can definitely see it in this type of work. And I think it's interesting. I think that those lessons have been instilled in you, and I can see them manifesting in different ways. But I was wondering if you could speak to how it emerges in your drawing, and how it, and particularly in the context of this particular installation.
I think it's very much in that TSU tradition, in that it reflects like a type of like power and elegance. That, like, my intention is to kind of reflect this idea of, you know, elevation in the Black image, and like as a way to kind of inform like a series of images in a culture that does not get to see that kind of stuff. When I say this out loud, I feel it sounds weird as I say it, but this is how I'm thinking about it as I'm working. Like, I feel like I'm working against like a bunch of different like images out in the world, in culture and in media, and so I'm trying to make images that, yeah, that just counter that thing, and that are informed by history, politics, as well as my own interest in science fiction and comics and costuming and all that kind of stuff. That TSU tradition was all about creating those types of images, things that, yeah, I think that just didn't exist, and I'm right in line with that. Yeah, and at the same time, like when I was in college, I also worked at Project Row Houses, which is a whole other art space, but that was directly informed by John Biggers and his practice. Project Row Houses is an art center in Houston. Artist Rick Lowe took 22 shotgun houses and created a nonprofit arts organization. They have installations, they have after-school program, all kinds of like nonprofit stuff. And it really informed, it was like the other arm that kind of informed my understanding of what art was. I swear I met actual like artists who weren't like faculty at my school, but like people who lived and worked as artists, and these were like Black artists who were like from other places and successful and doing all these things, and it's like, wow, you know, I didn't even know that thing could exist. And so, yeah, that was the other side that kind of basically reinforced this notion of community and like having that kind of reflected in your work. Community is a tricky word, but it's shorthand for now.
Well, I guess one of the things that I think is really interesting, so I think I'm going to be long-winded now, is that there are, just picking up on what the last statement that you've made, or the last couple of remarks that you've made, there are different ways of experiencing community, and there are different ways of understanding it. And what I think was interesting about Project Row Houses as a space is that they would emphasize the work of local practitioners, and their work was not, and then they would also show their work alongside people who have been very well recognized in the art world. So people like Fred Wilson have done projects at Project Row Houses, but then there are also local artists. Like, I don't know if Flower Man actually did an installation there. He was a local character in the 3rd Ward neighborhood, which is where Project Row Houses is based in Houston. But someone like Fred Wilson's work wouldn't have been prioritized over a local artist who was working. And what I think is interesting is that in your work, you are literally representing community, in that you are representing people from the artist community in Project Row Houses. And, or sorry, not in Houston, I should say. And many people are affiliated with Project Row Houses, or they have a relationship to Project Row Houses. But what I think is interesting in that is that what Project Row Houses did was it created an art space for people who did not necessarily have access to more traditional institutions or spaces for showing art. And so it created this opportunity for people to engage with art. So it was sort of this conflation of these notions of high and low art, and it was introducing a lot of people who may not have had prior experience to being involved in public art, to being involved in installation. And I think that your work functions in a similar way in that you might disagree with me on this, in that you use a lot of maybe traditional kind of high art or fine art, maybe postures or composition traits within your work, but then you are using people in your work, or people who are the subject of your artworks, who are creative, who are cultural producers. Many of them are artists, some of them are models, so there's that relationship to the artist muse. But I'm wondering if you can think about that and why it is, what leads you to decide who will be the subject of your work of art, and what do you think that says in turn about who is relegated to being a worthy subject of a work of art?
A worthy subject. So as you were saying that, I had to think about, like, it's not as direct of like process and series of choices as maybe you would think, or as it should be. So I like you said, like, it is like me sort of existing within a community of artists. And so as people, friends would come over to the studio for a long time, I think most of my friends knew, like, if you were hanging out at my studio at some point, you were gonna, And so I think the choice is as simple as that. Like, my process was based on, like, a very social kind of experience. This idea that, that these are people that I know, it's kind of I don't know if it's not that complicated, but, like, I know half the people in the room, right? These are friends of mine. That's my fiance in the back. This is a friend of hers that she went to school with. This is a poet I know in Omaha. As a former student on the end. But as I'm making these drawings, like, the shift happens pretty quickly, where who the model was it loses its relevance to what the image is going to be. So I am working in this thing of community, and, like, I think the process of creating my source material is probably where that is the heaviest. Once I start drawing and I have, like, a little bit of information, like, I kind of let go and I'm off to somewhere else. And I've recently been thinking about that, about where to, like, as I've sort of, number one, run through all of my friends and, just sort of done this so many times. And then, like, I started working with models, and it's not that it's easier, but there's just a different level of, like, comfort, I guess, because the sort of, like, capitalist kind of bend to it, like, hey, I'm paying you to kind of do this thing, turn this way, turn that way. Whereas, when I'm photographing friends, it's like, turn, yeah, but I need to tell you this thing, and blah, blah, blah. And it's a different kind of, like, push and pull. And I've even been thinking recently, especially I just recently moved to New York, and, like, it's such of a public kind of place. Like, in Houston, we're in our cars, we're in our homes, like, we're not out in the streets. But in New York, you kind of have to. And I'm actually just seeing, like, more people and more faces and more things that, like, get me really excited. Like, man, could I draw that person? And I've not. It is so awkward for me to even think about asking a stranger to pose for me. Like, I have no idea how to, like, I've never done that. And it's been on my mind to kind of start that process and how to do it without seeming creepy. Like, yeah, to have, But that's where I am now. Like, how do I start to work even without that kind of insular kind of community?
So I was thinking about, you kind of alluded to this, this process of transformation that occurs when the sitters for your work they shift from being people who you know and you're familiar with to representing a different figure in your work, or a different type of figure within your work. And I was thinking about that, but I guess for people who, say, are from Houston or who recognize who these people are, your work functions both as this representation of kind of fantastical space or an imagined space, but it also functions as this a documentation or a type of archive of cultural producers of the city of Houston and of the arts community, or the very specific arts community, the Black arts community in Houston. So I was wondering if you could talk about that duality of the work.
I don't know how to talk about that. I do think it does that. It does sort of like, you know, kind of catalog, not just like the thing that most of these people have in common is that they know me. So I think in some ways it's kind of an odd kind of documentation of a period and a place and a time, you know. I wonder about, like, so one of the things that I look at a lot when I'm making my work is, like, you know, I'm looking at all these different, like, ethnographic photos, right? Which have this sort of kind of problematic history, like these, you know, this, who's taking these photos and what are these photos for, and but in some ways I'm kind of replicating that process, but with, in some sense, with a different kind of relationship to the sitter. Maybe some of that gets severed when I start drawing, because at that point they no longer have a voice in what I'm doing. So maybe I'm reinscribing some of that same energy. I don't know. But I think that kind of root, like that ethnographic root, is probably, because I'm not just like photographing like this is my friend, you know, an artist. Like I'm really looking at, like, I don't know, like their physicality. So I think that there's something else happening besides just the documentation of a person. It's a documentation of, like, I don't know, like a look and an aesthetic of a particular kind of moment in time. And I don't know how else to think about it. It's one of those things that is happening, and maybe I haven't had time to really kind of consider that aspect of it, you know?
I mean, when you use a term like ethnography, then I start thinking about Edward Curtis. And I don't think that these works function in the same way that his photographs do. And his photographs, that type of imagery, I mean, you can certainly draw connections between the work that you're doing, which is in some ways a reaction to that type of documentation. But I think what's different is you are of this community and you have relationships with these people, and you're not there. I mean, I think you are making some decisions about the attire that they wear in terms of how you alter it or decorate it, et cetera, but you are not, there's not a practice of saying, hey, wear this costume, which has nothing to do with you're not a member of this tribe, but I'm going to adorn you in this type of clothing. Or do you think that you don't necessarily see these works as being collaborative? Or do you?
No. I mean, I don't, not in, yeah.
All right. So then maybe then what I will ask you next is to speak a bit on this idea of responding to a kind of gap or a lack in terms of representation, because I know that that is a catalyst for me in terms of making decisions about, I guess when I was a student, one of the things that I did was I went to study in a school that was a population of 90,000, and it was not very diverse. And I did a lot of self-portraiture, which I think a lot of art students do, and part of that is solipsism, but another part of that is there was a need for me to document myself in a space in which I could not see myself reflected. And some of those concerns, in varying ways, they've shifted into my into the work that I do as a curator. And I'm wondering if you can speak about some of the decisions that you've made or some of the things that inform the type of work that you do.
Decisions in like formal decisions or like references, or I'm curious because we're supposed to be in conversation. I think it's going. I think to get to that, I think so. As the curator, as a person who, like, you invited me to do the show, but the work wasn't created. So there's like a gap between what you like have seen and what has come. And like, how do you, not like, what do you think, but like, like how did like thinking, because you saw the work in process and like came to the studio when I was about halfway done, and like those, they're different than some of the earlier work. And in your curatorial process, like how does it sort of, I don't know what my question is. Like, how does it affect how you think about the rest of the exhibition afterwards? Because you have one idea going in, and then there's a shift, or you see the work, and it's like, well, okay, maybe it's not that, it's this, or maybe I don't know if that's putting you on the spot. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but
try to avoid the things that will get me into trouble. I think in doing curatorial work, unless you are working with a collection, with the art of, and largely with the art of artists who are deceased, there's always an element of risk and chance, particularly when you invite artists to create new works. So, yes, because apparently I like stress or something, but, and actually one of the things that happened in the first show that I worked on, because I've only actually worked with you on one other occasion, and in that there was an experience of an artist who had committed to producing a particular, or actually not even producing a work, but shipping a work for this show that I was doing with another curator. And when the work was shipped, it was shipped, and then that day we got an email from her studio manager saying, oh, this artist is excited, she's created a new work, and she's really excited to show it for the first time. And she was shipping it to a space that was shutting down for the winter break. It was at a university gallery, so there was no way of trying to intervene, and we just had to kind of accept it and deal with it. But it ended up being fine. But I think because I had worked with you before, and I had seen the way in which you approached issues of history. And what I think is interesting was, I think you had showed 2 works in that exhibition. The exhibition was called 28 Days, and it was artists who were, I think, 18 or 19 artists who were based in Canada and the US and the UK who were interrogating Black History Month, or the Black History Month exhibition. And so Robert contributed 2 works to that installation. And one of the pieces was, I can't remember what the title is, but it was of a series of 6 clocks. And I thought that was really, and what was it called?
What time is the revolution coming? Yeah.
And so if you can jump in if I am describing it incorrectly, but there were a series of six clocks. They were the sort of type of institutional clock that you would encounter in a hospital or in a bank or a public school, probably in the 70s, 60s, 70s, that sort of modernist aesthetic. And they were set to time zones in different cities around the world. And they were cities in which Black demographics had rioted to protest social conditions, different social inequities, et cetera. So one of the things that I'm really intrigued by are the ways in which artists choose to represent instances of violence without exploiting the images of people who are attached to those sort of violent or oppressive histories. So I think that was one of the things that intrigued me, even beyond the work that you do as someone who works in a really figurative realm. And so I think that because I hadn't done an entire exhibition with you, but I knew the ways in which you had worked, And I was familiar with those ways. I think that was something that I was open to doing. But I think one of the things that's interesting, to go back to your initial question, was that I think what is difficult as a curator is when someone is making work and you don't have that period of time of becoming acquainted with the work beforehand. But at the same time, if you're familiar with someone's practice, you usually will have tools in order to respond to it. And so, I mean, I don't think you were fishing for compliments, but I was very pleased with how this turned out. But I think it was interesting. But I think one of the things was that Patrick Degas, who I think is here, I know he's here, I can't see, there he is, hi Patrick. So the Ulrich Museum had confirmed a solo exhibition of his work, and he was also making work that was in progress. But because I knew that it would be very figurative, I thought it would be interesting to invite other artists who were dealing with figuration in very different ways, so that we would have a number of perspectives to sort of move through. And I don't always curate in that way, thematically, I guess, but it was a really loose thematic. And so we have these, 4 very unique perspectives and sort of riffs on this theme of the figure. And I think most of the artists, I think I'm correct in saying that all of you who are showing at this point would probably balk at your work being described in such a reductive way, but that was, I thought it was okay to kind of have that type of a through line moving through the work, because there were these vastly different sort of ways of using that as a platform. Well, I don't think people were using that as a platform, but because everybody's work was about such vastly different themes, I think it was okay to organize around that way. And I don't think it's not really something that's been publicized or I've shared that much, but I think it was okay because I don't feel that it limited the work in that way. And I think we have a dynamic set of shows, but I'm biased.
You asked about like making choices in the work, which is why I was curious about like how you sort of work through this kind of process, because I mean the way I make choices is shifting, and for a long time I would use references to like African objects and all kinds of things, and these figures would just be laden with all kinds of just like material objects like drawn in, and that has like changed. There's just fewer things going on in the drawings, and I don't know if that was like an expected kind of thing. So you kind of, you have to work with an artist where they are, I guess. But how I make those choices, I don't know. Like it's not random, but it's a very like intuitive, wrought kind of process. Like I have a Tumblr that I collect images, and I'm looking at that stuff. I get the drawing started. I have no idea where it's going. I have the person come by, I photograph them. I figure out which one of those photographs has the correct pose that feels right. I get maybe a really light outline of that, and then I start thinking about what is this drawing? Who is this person? What are they doing? What are they telling me? And I don't know. It just builds from there. And like the moment I have like some inkling of an idea, that becomes a seed, and it just kind of grows out of there. But I have a well of things that I go back to. Obviously, like space travel, the cosmos, certain kinds of like Black political histories, and then I'm trying to add in some new sort of like much more abstract kind of things to fill out some things, and then I just kind of figure out what goes where, and yeah.
So in terms of this exhibition, you've mentioned that these works sort of represent a new direction for your work. And we made a decision to not include images of earlier works that you've produced. So in this presentation. So I'm wondering if you could speak to how your work, how this is different from earlier works that you've done. In what ways have you maintained some of those earlier interests in, say, science fiction? I think that's really obvious. Maybe some literary references. We've talked about Octavia Butler's work a bit, and we also mentioned, well, when we've had prior discussions, we talked a little bit about Sunhwa, and so I think we would be remiss to not mention that and discuss that. But I'm wondering if you can also speak about the role of music and other art forms in your practice, how they inform your work and how your work deviates from some of these things.
I'll start with Sunhwa. Do you guys know Sunhwa? Jazz musician, was abducted by aliens. He claims it. I'm going to say it's true. He was abducted by aliens, and from then on out, like his practice was about like translating, I think, the information of that abduction, and it was like a liberatory kind of sort of direction he took after that, like a way of like liberating Black people in America and throughout the world, I assume, through music. He has a science fiction movie, Space is the Place, if anybody's ever seen it. It was my introduction to Sunhwa, which is why I think I'm so attracted to like his whole thing. Like it was such of a visual experience watching this. It was a 70s sci-fi movie that looked to be rooted in like blaxploitation aesthetics. And Sunhwa is not an actor. And so it was badly acted, and the effects were not that great, but it was just like an amazing kind of, I don't know. I love Sunhwa. And so the notion of escape is a reoccurring theme in my work. I mean, there are these two images, the women with the Harriet Tubman tattoo and the NK-33A, which is a rocket ship. For me, both of those are like modes of escape, like escapism, and like the idea that the only like way out is to escape, and not necessarily like a literal escape, but a sort of like like a psychic escape of like removing yourself from the sort of like really oppressive sort of Eurocentric context in which you live your life or view the world. Like, what if you saw it from like a different angle? And I think there's a little bit of liberation in that. And for me, like all of that is rooted in Sunhwa and his kind of mythologies. And I don't know what else. You're excellent.
I can come back to ask some of those other questions as well. But one of the things that I thought was interesting too is we had discussed Afrofuturism, and you were saying that you wouldn't necessarily classify your work or place it under that umbrella. But one of the things that I thought was interesting in terms of thinking about it and looking at this work and thinking about Sunhwa was going back to, was this our idea of history, but also music, and thinking about African American spirituals, because they articulated this, like a similar notion of escape as a way of being able to withstand the horrors of slavery and the violences of slavery. So I think it's interesting and it's distressing to realize that these are constants that emerge in different types of creative practices. But what I also think was interesting was, in terms of thinking about Octavia Butler, thinking about the aesthetic of your drawings. In many ways, they're very accessible. So you look at them and you may not exactly know what's going on, but there are a lot of very subtle gestures that you make throughout your work. And so if we look at the image that's, now I'm trying to orient myself in terms of the directions. It's on the south wall. It's the closest to the entryway, which is called Black Orrery. And something, and I was discussing this with you, thinking about the fact that that model was your student, and there's a model of the solar system sitting beside her. So in some ways it's commenting on pedagogy. It's commenting on education, but it's also commenting on the ways in which, if we think about science fiction, it's seen as being this, it's considered to be a nerdy kind of thing, right? But then also within that, even though that's a kind of a derisive way of looking at it, but it's also this acknowledgement that it's marking it as being this very intellectual kind of highbrow activity. So then in associating, making that a sort of relationship between a Black subject, between a young Black woman in science is interesting. And it actually made me think about hidden figures, and it made me think about one of my mother's younger sister, my aunt, who I've spoken about to you quite a bit, she's a scientist. And I was thinking about that in terms of these gaps in representation, how you're making these kind of subtle relationships that are speaking about multiple issues in many different ways. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Like the representation of...
Maybe if you could speak about that a little bit, and think, maybe Octavia Butler, just because I just want to hear you talk about Octavia Butler. But then also if you could speak about the ways in which you incorporate objects into your work. So these, I guess you could say they're all representations of three-dimensional objects, but why you make decisions about including specific objects into your work, because that's a trait or a conceit of your work that has been consistent throughout your practice.
I think that I'm always trying to figure out, so all of these people kind of come from the same space, or the same, imagined kind of fantastical space. And part of that is, these are, in my mind, liberated people. Truly, liberated, Black people. And so I'm trying to figure out number one, how do I express that through, the portrait, through adornment primarily, the objects and the clothes they wear and the objects that they carry, and what would this individual person kind of carry with them? And then I always want to do this thing where what is what's not the craziest thing, but what's the most sort of abnormal thing that I can put in and make it feel normal? So So it's just a model she has. It's you ever see those orreries? They're mechanical objects that actually spin. I don't think you could possibly build one that would work as a watch, and that would, And so I wanted to because it's drawing, which is the power of drawing, you can make anything real. And so I wanted to kind of make that object, and it's an awkward object. If you can imagine somebody actually wearing that, you'd be bumping and breaking it all the time, but her class and elegance prevents that. She would never break it. She would never be caught slipping like that. I kind of always want to include something that just feels, that just takes it away from being a normal portrait. I need it to be a little bit fantastic and not, And I think that is probably the thing that's most different about this show is much of this work is much more subdued than my traditional work. That level of fantasticness, whatever, is fantastical elements it's much more subdued than in previous work. I don't know where I'm going with that. I think I just kind of needed to work in a much more meditative kind of way. Yeah. And Octavia Butler is great. I've probably read about 4 of her books. Octavia Butler, I don't read a lot of sci-fi. I find a lot of I don't read enough of it to really be able to speak about it. I'm a very much a pop culture, Star Wars, I love Marvel comics, these sort of very traditional kind of things. And I'll watch almost any kind of sci-fi. If it's in outer space, I'm watching it. But in terms of reading sci-fi, I find it to be I think sci-fi can be problematic, right? It's very problematic. And Star Trek, our sort of pivotal pop culture space travel show, which is about this idealized future where diversity is resolved, and it's obviously it still centers this sort of like heroic white man, and even the later episodes of Next Generation and Voyager, they all sort of had very similar problems when it came to race. All these aliens they meet, it's just othering, and I mean, I still watch them, but it's problematic. I forgot where I was going with that. We were talking about. Oh, so like it. I find that some of the science fiction like novels and things, I think, hold a lot of that. And for just discovering her, like this black woman writing about where the main protagonist was a black woman, and then there were like this like lineage of stories, and like I don't know, it was like really nuanced, amazing, sort of like fantastic writing in ways that like didn't do the thing that those other stories I feel do. And like I don't know, it was sort of I don't know, it was just a relief to read that, and like to know that stuff was, I don't even know how much more stuff like that is out there, except for maybe things that are really, really current, like, in terms of people writing science fiction. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, so I just have two more questions for you. So one is, I was wondering if you could speak about how you approach gender in your work. And then the other thing was, because you started with this, and I think this is a really important component of your work, the acknowledgements that you make through each of these works to other artists who are working. So I'm hoping you can speak to those two things before we open it up to the audience.
So in my work, like I said, these are all sort of, it's from an entire cast of like liberated people. And for me, part of that is flipping like our normative experience on its head. So like as we live in a culture that is primarily like a patriarchy, it's white and male as like the normative narrative kind of experience. In my work, the normative experience is black and female. Which can be tricky. It's not that I'm trying to speak for women, but I'm trying to, like, what happens if every time you made a story, it was obvious that the hero had to be a black woman? Like that's where I began. And so this takes me back to TSU, where, like, our whole drawing instruction was based on these, like, matriarchal sort of mythologies that John Biggers and Harvey Johnson were sort of creating in their work and extending to us as their students, as, the black woman is the great mother and that kind of thing. And so I'm still sort of responding to that in a sense. And other artists. So I don't know how evident it is in this work. So I often refer to artists that have come before me, right? And they're usually black artists. I mean, although I've kind of mentioned like Yayoi Kusama once, but almost primarily I'm looking at a canon of African American and African artists who were working, much further back than me, and some of them still working today, as a way to kind of like create, it's not my own canon of work, but like a canon that can like be the root of my practice. So, people see your work and like, oh, you're working on this thing, have you thought about this artist? Like, I want it to be understood that like I'm looking at these artists, many of whom are forgotten. I talk about Charles White. Charles White is a very pivotal figure who does not, outside of like, black art circles, I don't think really gets discussed very often. Yeah, so I'm always trying to hark back to these, earlier artists. Yeah. Oh, Basquiat. Yeah, Basquiat is one of those artists. I mean, I use him a lot, but I think there's a little bit of a difference in that his work is much more like contemporary, and I think it operates like I use these other objects. I'll take people's artwork and make it a headdress. I'll make somebody's painting into a cape. I'll convert the thing that they made into like a type of adornment. And that kind of happens here, but I think his work, because it wasn't that long ago, kind of, it speaks the same kind of like contemporary art language. I don't know. It just feels different to me when I use his work as opposed to like Meadowlark Fuller and like, you know?
I think what's interesting about Basquiat is his work is often not seen within the trajectory of Black artistic production and Black diasporic artistic production. So I think more recently he's begun to be, or his work has begun to be included within the Caribbean diaspora. But also, I think he was an artist who very much suffered from, during his lifetime and until more recent scholarship, from this separation that we kind of alluded to but didn't really delve deep into. His work wasn't seen as being intellectual, even though he was someone who was extremely well-read. This was someone who was a polyglot.
Maybe you just said, do you think his work is still considered?
No, I think there's been more of a shift, but I think it's interesting to have his work connected to the work of other artists who are working in very dynamic ways. But I also think that just in speaking with younger artists, this is someone who is extremely influential in terms of their own respective practices. So, and I think that kind of the tragedy of his life or his biography is something that overshadows his practice. So I really like that there's this nod to him, which also speaks to the way in which his work has been commercialized, but it's also about absorbing it into this larger kind of rubric. All right, okay. Well, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience, if there are any. Okay.
Okay. I appreciate the mural, the Byzantine mural comment. Like, I do kind of want that sort of element to kind of inform the work. The gaze is also a thing that often happens. So that it's twofold. Initially in my practice, I always had the figure looking at the viewer. Like I wanted, like, I was sort of interested in this idea that these images, after I make them, they go out into the world, and I'm not there to talk about them. Sometimes, like, I'm not there to like protect them, right? And so I try to draw these figures that can protect themselves, and sometimes that look is about a challenge to the viewer. I think literally I just want the sort of like, when you are looking at the image, I mean, I'm well aware this is just a 2D image, but like that there is some sense of being looked back at, which kind of affects how you are able to like project your own stuff or whatever onto the drawing. More recently, I have stopped doing that, but it's not a purposeful thing. Like I say, it's very intuitive. Like the last exhibition I had, all the work I made prior to this, not one image was facing the viewer, and I hadn't even noticed that. And I feel like it was also at a time where I had stopped using these African objects. I had started to like really change what the work was about, and I don't know if that maybe freed up the gaze a little bit for them to even look beyond the viewer. So yeah, I mean, my initial thing is like how they look back at the viewer. Where it is now, it's still something I'm trying to wrestle with, and I just kind of let it happen in a very like organic kind of way. It is like I was mainly just being sort of very experimental. So I do these like really sparse backgrounds. I stain the paper with that's coffee that I'm staining it with, and I typically leave the background very open and empty, sort of. And I've been wanting to add a bit more atmosphere, and I think this is like a kind of a boring formal answer, but I've been wanting to have like more depth in the background, just to allude to some sort of fictional space. And so you'll see like here, there's a little bit, and even in the drawing in the back. And I kind of come in and out of that, but these kind of things begin this way, and this time I decided I really, really liked it, and I wanted to leave it that way, and it began to inform what the drawing became, because it feels very cocoon-like to me, and sort of like caught in the spider's web. And it's called the nonce, which is the sort of like the spider figure in like West African, yeah. So it came out of an experimentation and like a formal shift in how I wanted to approach the backgrounds. But then it kind of became its own thing. Back here? Right. I mean, in just that way, like, I was a little hesitant to make that tattoo, because as I stopped using those like African objects, because I wanted to like not misuse materials that don't come from my own kind of like world experience and culture, and that tattoo even like it's a thing that is not part of my own sort of like cultural traditions, and so I felt a little iffy, but I feel like I didn't sort of try to disrespect like the origin of that image, and I really kind of wanted to maybe elevate Harriet Tubman to this kind of position. But yeah, I think I'm looking at things that read a certain way out in the real world, and how can I bring that reading into the work and even alter it a little bit. I mean, so my symbolism is, it's just that. Even like the tattoo, those are called letters for an actual rocket, but what happens when it's on the body and, yeah. Well, I have one here. No. That one is like, very specifically referencing a drawing by Charles White. Yeah, even the title and like the jacket and. I mean, it's piece by piece. It's piece by piece. I think, like, for example, Supreme Lover. Like, I wanted to do this drawing of this guy, and I wanted it to be, for me, like a Christ-like figure. And so that really led how I started choosing my references. So, like, he has, like, this crown of roses, but, like, roses have these thorns, which is, like, a very kind of literal kind of way to, but still, it's a literal way to represent that, but also, I think, change the feeling of it a little bit, and even like the birth of Earth, like the sort of creation kind of myth, like him carrying it on his shirt. So like what I wanted that guy to be, which happened like after I finished basically drawing the figure. Like he looked like a very kind of bronze looking person to me, and it just took me to that place that I was already kind of trying to get to within the theme of the exhibition, and then that just led me to those references. And it usually happens like that, like a little thread of something will kind of create the arc of all the different. Most times. I mean, sometimes I know exactly what's going to happen from start to finish, but that's really rare. I love those moments, but it's really rare. Sometimes it just happens, I get the pose in, and then it starts to speak to me. Okay. Yeah, I think that I'm like the things that happen in that kind of like really pop kind of like I don't allow that to kind of lead like how I make my decisions. Like Basquiat was interesting to me like before that stuff, and then even after like the trendiness of it kind of dies away, I think I will still have this interest. So like I think I'm just still in the middle of like my own appreciation for his work, and so like because the risk is that it's an overdone kind of thing, and like but because I'm kind of working within my own kind of context, I don't have to. I don't know if protective is the right word, and I don't even know if I am a person that could fully like break down his work and speak to it, but I do have like a deep fondness for his work that I feel, and so I don't think the feeling is protective. I think the feeling is they don't really know, and so I don't have to protect it. Like he protected it already, just in the way that he worked. Like he coded it, and yeah. At some point, we will get to the center of like like what his work I think really is. Yeah, I think he already protected it. Yeah. Oh no. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. So I reduced my color palette to just the colors that were available within the spectrum of Conte pencils, which is a very like earth tone based kind of. You get a variation of red, and then you have black and white, and so I'll use color if like it absolutely calls for it. Like in that Birth of Earth, like there were some colors that don't come in Conte, so I had to use some pastels. But for the most part, I'm just trying to stick to like I was trying to like I've been making these drawings for a few years, and like I felt like I needed to maybe recenter my practice in a sense. This is I don't know. This is just like I don't think this is interesting. It's just interesting to me. But it is the reason like I just reduced my palette to kind of maybe rein myself in a little bit and like challenge myself to still work. Like where's the core of what I'm doing? And like my love of drawing is like in this one space, and I need to kind of like focus on that for a while. Yeah. This woman? Yeah, that's Lisa. She's a singer in Houston. She's an opera singer. She does a lot of recordings. She went to school with my fiance. She would wear red. She wears like sometimes some really bright and she's a character. The threads. So again, like rooting back to like earlier artists. One of the things John Biggers would do would be to have these sort of these portraits of Black women sort of weaving the cosmos together, and he would do that by having these sort of like thread lines that kind of went from the figure throughout the composition of the painting and all over the place. And it's me just sort of taking a note from that and trying to create almost like a literal kind of version of that. And so I've been sort of incorporating these like thread lines as a way to create a sense of like abstraction in the work, like a thing that I can do that is not like a very specific reference. Like I can make shapes and lines that don't rely on a particular kind of symbolism. And it felt very like freeing to kind of have that thing. And I've only done it a couple of times, but yeah. I'll tell you something.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Robert, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Sally.